Go ahead.
When I was a kid, my mother would often take us to a local children's theater in a nearby museum, Adventure Theater. One of the productions that we saw was a retelling of the Jewish folk tale of the Golem of Prague. As I've stated before, I was an easily frightened child, and honestly, we only lasted for a few minutes into the performance before I became so terrified that we had to leave. But I'm a grown up now, and so I feel enough critical distance from this story to retell it to you now. Sometime in the late 16th century, there was a rabbi, Judah Lo ben Bezalel, who created a creature of clay, a golem, to defend the Jewish ghetto of the city of Prague from the frequent pogroms sent by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. While most people believe that this story to be a fantasy, it should be noted that both Rabbi Lo and Rudolph II were actual historical figures. Anyway, the rabbi would animate the golem by writing the word Amet, Hebrew for truth, onto the golem, and would cause the golem to become dormant by erasing the aleph from the sacred word, forming another word, Met, meaning death. He would do this every Friday before the beginning of Sabbath, but one week he neglected to do so, and because the golem violated the Lord's day of rest, God allowed it to go on a violent rampage, killing indiscriminately, until the rabbi was able finally to remove the first letter of his inscription, which caused the golem to crumble into dust. This episode of Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, poses a connection between this old legend and the situation that the Connors find themselves in. Last episode, we asked the question whether Sarah was becoming more like the monsters that she runs from and sometimes hunts, and the possibility that Skynet is in some sense created in the image and likeness of fallen, violent, and murderous humanity. This episode deviates somewhat from the original moral lesson of the Golem story about violating the law of God, the divine plan, and the destruction that can result, and asks a more modern question about whether there is really a plan or a fate to begin with. We will explore the implications of this change in theme. I'm Calvin.
I'm Ian.
Come with us if you want to live.
So, as usual, this is a spoiler podcast. We will be discussing the entire plot of this episode, as well as the 3 episodes that precede it, and if we feel like it, Terminator 3. So, everything we've covered so far. We will try to avoid doing any big spoiling of the rest of the series or other movies, although the series does kind of assume that you have seen the first 2 Terminator films. So, with that said, let's start our discussion.
Yeah, so we did the episode on Terminator 3 in part because we felt that it had connections both to episode 3 of the Sarah Connor Chronicles and episode 4, this episode. The connection being that in episode 3, the idea is introduced, really kind of exploring the idea that the weapon that Skynet chooses to use to destroy humanity is our own nuclear arsenal, and that nuclear attack is depicted in Terminator 3. And in this episode, I think it really explores an idea which is presented also in Terminator 3, which is the idea that Skynet has been preparing for Judgment Day for years before it actually occurs. In Terminator 3, that conspiracy manifests itself as the development of the original T robots and other technologies that are in the Air Force base that's depicted in that movie, and also the fact that it plants a computer virus in the defense network of the United States. This episode seems to pose the idea that a different version of Skynet has a different conspiracy at play, which we don't fully understand.
Yeah, there's a lot of I would say, logical thoughts that a writer might have about a time travel war with an artificial intelligence, that this episode and Terminator 3 follow to their conclusions and use them to wring out some drama, with John Connor having to face multiple different threads of Skynet's danger to humanity. We have an initial question for our heroes, asking, are they trying to be heroes?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the episode, it's begun to have recaps of previous episodes, and often the way those are edited together emphasizes the theme for the coming episode that we're about to watch. And so in the recap, it shows scenes from the previous episode in which both Sarah and Cameron are questioning John on whether he should try to be a hero and saving a fellow student who commits suicide. And he says, isn't that what I'm supposed to be, a hero? And this episode sort of continues to develop that idea.
There's some interesting, what I would call, thematic and even plot redundancies in this episode that I think are an artifact of when it was produced in 2008. People were still functioning, TV writers were still functioning on the assumption that most hardcore fans were only watching about 1 in 4 episodes of the show that they loved. The phenomenon of people who watched every single episode was still not close enough to common that writers could assume that every episode would be seen by their audience. And so we have this repetition of the question, what is John's purpose as a character? What does it mean for him to be a hero in this fight against Skynet and in his own development as a person, as a from a boy to a young man, as well as the development of the threats that he is going to face, these various Terminators that he sees. You could see this episode as a Terminator of the Week, which of course is a takeoff on the common monster or case of the week that was derided by so many TV critics and reviewers in the early to mid 2000s. And the showrunners and writers have often said they didn't have the budget to come up with a Terminator of the Week and make it satisfying, but they did their best sometimes, and I think this would be one of the closest to a Terminator of the Week that you're going to find in the show.
Yeah, so in this episode, we're presented with a kind of cold open in which the Terminator that we know as Cromartie continues his plan to remake himself in order to go covertly as a human again. He visits a plastic surgeon and adopts the identity of a out-of-work actor named George Laszlo, who's played by Garrett Dillahunt. And so this is our first episode where we get to see Garrett Dillahunt, which I think we both agree is kind of exciting.
Yeah, Garrett Dillahunt's a really good actor. He's done a lot of theater, interestingly, for an actor who's made it in the film and television world. He still likes to do plays. He's very thoughtful in a lot of ways, and because he tends to he is from the South, and so he does tend to play characters who have that Southern feeling. And because of the way Hollywood works, that means he often is cast as a villainous, threatening, or
Comic
hayseed
relief
type
doof.
of rogue. Yeah.
Yes, he's either cast as a villain or a comic relief doof.
But I will say that his villain here is much more complicated than most of people, most men of his extraction and caliber. I'm trying to remember who's that guy who plays all the bad guy, Walton Goggins. So I would say you could, if you were being cynical, you just could describe Garrett Dillahunt as budget Walton Goggins. And I say budget because Walton Goggins has been in a lot more movies, and Garrett Dillahunt has been in a lot more TV. But
yeah, most recently, Walter Goggins was a Ant-Man 3.
oh, that's right, he was that. That was not a very interesting role for him.
Well, it was a moot upgrade because he was just kind of like he was like a mook in Ant-Man 2, and then he becomes MODOK in the third movie. So he got a significant upgrade.
I think you're thinking of the other guy, the bald guy.
Maybe I'm misremembering. Anyway, back to Sarah Connor Chronicles.
Ant-Man 3 was a very forgettable movie. But I really like the range that this role or multiple roles allow Garrett Dillahunt to really stretch his acting muscles. And he's a great villain and a great interesting character, even aside from the structural role of villain or antagonist that he plays. So I'm really glad that they did him. People have mentioned that the guy they first cast as Cromartie wasn't very good, so it's possible that's why they did this whole elaborate he has to rebuild himself thing, so they could get to the much better actor of Garrett Dillahunt.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting idea. I think it's also developing on the theme that's introduced in the second scene after the first commercial break, in which Cameron presents the Connors with the information that she thinks that Cromartie is still active, based on her review of the news footage from when they emerged from their time jump, and she's able to see Cromartie's skull in the footage, and so she thinks that Cromartie is still active and is possibly attempting to rebuild himself, which is an adaptative feature that the newer models of Terminators have, including herself. That was not as much in evidence in the model that we see in the first Terminator movie. You know, the Arnie Terminator is sort of able to perform minor repairs to his human exo flesh, but he's not able to really repair himself in any significant way during the course of that encounter. But these newer models are able to repair themselves and to adapt to new situations, as we've seen. And so I think that's really kind of developing a theme that we'll see throughout the series, the idea that Skynet is able to adapt and change based on its response to the actions of the Connors and the Resistance as a whole.
Yeah, there's an interesting deleted scene from the second Terminator movie in which it's revealed that Skynet doesn't like its Terminators to have learning capacity turned on when they're on long range missions. Sort of an implication that Skynet is a uneasy villain who is worried about its minions becoming as smart or smarter than it. But it seems like this version of Skynet in Sarah Connor Chronicles has abandoned the idea that it needs to have dumb, obedient minions and wants learning, intelligent, long term thinking minions instead, which possibly reflects the changes required by the various time travel shenanigans. The fact that it has now sent back not just the first Terminator, the first Arnie Terminator, and the T-1000 second Terminator, but it's also sent back at least 3 or 4 other Terminators to try and get John Connor and do other missions for it. So we're starting to see a real development of Skynet as a time travel war fighter instead of just a simple hunter-killer programmer.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this episode is it also presents the idea that there's sort of a wider conspiracy going on to the activity of Skynet than merely just hunter-killer program cyborgs. That different Terminators, different cyborgs are programmed to do different missions that don't necessarily immediately relate to terminating a individual human subject. And so we're given kind of a stinger at the end of that scene. Again, repeating the problem posed in the first pilot episode, whether the Connors and Cameron should run or whether they should actually go hunting for Cromartie.
And this feels like another instance of redundant writing, so that if you miss the pilot and you heard about it from your friends, you get that same feeling from John of he's tired of running that you got from the pilot.
Yeah, so this episode... Oh, sorry.
Once they get to the first place that Cameron has determined they need to investigate, they knock out a what turns out to be a person, and Cameron says that he's a human, which once again brings up this question of humanity versus the Terminators, and especially when it comes to Sarah and increasingly with John, have they taken on more of the Terminator's qualities while the Terminators have taken on more of humanity's qualities?
I mean, that is a more sophisticated reading of that part of the scene than maybe I think the writers intended. I think the writers intended sort of it's and I'm not saying this to be overly critical, but it is a somewhat cheap attempt at suspense. That guy's obviously a Terminator because he's built like a Terminator, but then we're faked out. Maybe that plays into the idea that the show wants to teach us as an audience to suspect that anybody could be a Terminator. It's not just going to be muscular dudes that look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but that anybody, any human could be a Terminator. Anyone that looks human could be a Terminator. So maybe there's some intention there also.
I think there were. I think that the writers really want to hammer home this idea in all the parallels and permutations they could of what is it to be human, what is it to be a machine, and is there a connection between those things?
Well, and one of the reasons that Cameron knows that the Terminator that they do actually find in the warehouse is not Cromartie is because he has a shorter stature than the Cromartie endoskeleton. And in fact, the actor that they cast to play that Terminator, who's called Carter, is quite a short actor. He's shorter than John, Thomas Dekker.
And Thomas Dekker is not a particularly tall man.
Yes. Then we're kind of reintroduced into our B plot as Ellison continues to examine crime scenes. This time the crime scene of the plastic surgeon. He has a fun line where one of the local law enforcement say, "How come you seem to show up anytime something weird happens?" And he says, "Well, if you log weird things into the computer, poof, I appear." He discovers that the blood that doesn't seem to be human blood is at the crime scene, and he also discovers security camera footage of someone leaving the surgeon's office, who is George Laszlo, who he thinks is
Well,
George Laszlo, but is in
it
fact
is the thing
Cromartie.
with George Laszlo's face.
Yes, a thing with George Laszlo's face. It is interesting that Cromartie chooses to, and maybe this goes to the idea that Terminators do not perfectly adapt to human behavior. Cromartie chooses to adopt the face of a known person, doesn't avoid the cameras in any way, doesn't seem to bother cleaning up the crime scene, or avoiding detection by human law enforcement. So Cromartie is not a perfect infiltrator unit, at least not in this scenario.
You pointed out an interesting Easter egg when you come to the shipping company that this short Terminator has started up.
Yes. I think the idea, it's a little bit fuzzy, but I think the idea is that this shipment of coltan was ordered by some industrial company, perhaps a shell company for Skynet. It's not really made clear, but it's being shipped in a truck called with the company name of Tetsuo. Tetsuo can either be a reference to the 1970s Japanese horror film Tetsuo the Iron Man, in which either it depicts, it's unclear, it's a very expressionist film, but either depicts the descent into madness of a salaryman, or someone who is put under a curse in which his body slowly turns into metal in a horrific way. It's either a reference to that Tetsuo, or it's a reference to Tetsuo, the antagonist of the Japanese manga and anime film Akira, who is a teenage young man who's been granted superhuman powers by exposure to a nuclear blast, and uses those to destroy Neo Tokyo. I don't think it has any bearing on kind of the main plot. It's just, like I said, kind of a little Easter egg for nerds.
Well, I feel like if you've got people watching a Terminator show, the odds are fairly likely that they will be nerds. I could be wrong, but that is my feeling.
Yeah, so John poses sort of, there's this tussle of wills between Sarah and John. As soon as Sarah discovers that this Terminator is not Cromartie, seems to have a different program and plan that they don't even know what's going on. She expresses what seems like for her genuine terror, that the idea that, as she says, this thing has employees and owns real estate. Again, indicating a depth to the Skynet conspiracy that we had previously not understood. And she's like, we just got to get out of here. Whereas John wants to stay and fight. She says, no, that's dangerous. And he says, this is a war, implying that in his mind, the war has already begun. It's not just a war that's going to occur in the future, but that the war has already begun. And he says, war is dangerous. And he points out that the coltan in that shipment could potentially produce many future soldiers in that war. Cameron, of course, does the math for us and says that a shipment of coltan of that volume could produce 530 Terminators. So the question is will they sabotage Skynet's, what seems to be Skynet's plan in the here and now, or will they simply wait until after Judgment Day to fight? John chooses to not wait, runs off from Cameron and Sarah, and gets trapped in the back of a truck.
John gets trapped a lot in this episode, which I think is both supposed to be deliberately metaphorical, because John is, of course, trapped in the role that Kyle, his father, told Sarah about before he was even conceived. However, I also think that in addition to the symbolic resonance of him being trapped multiple times, John also is evidencing that he is not in a place to fight or lead yet. He is immature and impulsive, and someone who fights against a machine that's been fighting a time war for decades and decades needs to be able to think past his immediate fears and desires. And so I think this is definitely setting up an immaturity in John that we will see grown out of throughout the 2 seasons of the show.
Well, and he also goes off by himself alone. So he's not yet become a leader who's willing to work with a group.
Or delegate to people who are better at what he needs them to do than he is.
Right, which is a key to the success of the apparent success of the Resistance in the future, is that they work together to fight Skynet.
Yeah.
Sarah is very upset by this. She tells Cameron that he's not supposed to be doing this, that it's too soon. And Cameron says, is it? The world ends in 4 years.
You got to have that ticking clock. We then snap back to the Ellison plotline where he's brought in Laszlo, or at least something with Laszlo's face, and is trying to get his evidence because there's been this weird blood. So he wants to take Laszlo's blood. He's being his most charming and folksy, whereas Laszlo, or apparently Laszlo, is acting as stone-faced as possible. And you're really wondering, is this going to turn out to be the Terminator, and Ellison's going to have first-hand experience of the robots that he suspects exist? But
okay, so this is a question I actually want to ask you. Did you think that maybe it was Cromartie?
Yes, I did.
See, either because I've seen this before and I was remembering what happens, or just my impression of this scene is that it's obviously George Laszlo. And so I felt like the whole suspense of, is this George Laszlo or is this Cromartie, to be kind of fake suspense.
See, I remembered that it was really Laszlo because of his fascist line, but I still feel like, so this goes back to the pilot thing with Cameron. People are like, well, Cameron's so normal and flirty like a real human in the first scene with John, and Josh Friedman is like, no, she's super weird, what are you talking about? I think that given the constraints of a television shooting and the multiple directors and writers and moving pieces to every episode and every scene, sometimes they do things for suspense or supposedly fake suspense that don't quite hit the right emotional impact. And this to me is one of those things. I think that they're definitely trying to fake you out here, and it stands out much more as weird when you know it's coming, to me.
Yeah, so so George Laszlo has the great line at the end where, we know that Ellison is the hero of this series, uh, and one of, if not our favorite character. But George Laszlo does not know that, and so he accuses Ellison of being a fascist at the end of the scene for demanding a blood sample without a warrant and being extremely manipulative. Then we cut back to the Connor plotline, in which Sarah and Cameron brutalize a poor mook into taking them to where the coltan shipment is going.
I mean,
Which we
it's a question of how poor he is. He's the only one of the Terminator's employees who makes it out of this episode alive.
Well, we assume he's still alive at the end of the episode. They leave him in the middle of a minefield. He may be blown up or die
Why
of
are there
dehydration.
minefields in America? That seems weird to me.
Not everything in this episode makes perfect sense, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But the main point is that they go to the McGuire gunnery range. I thought it was interesting. Is it McGuire? Is that what it says on the sign?
I don't remember the
If
exact
if
word.
if that's so, then it's strange because McGuire Air Force Base is a real Air Force base. It's not in Southern California. It's in New Jersey. So I thought that part was interesting. But again, kind of returning to this theme that we saw in Terminator 3, the movie, which is that Skynet seems to be using the apparatus of the U.S. military in order to carry out its conspiracy. In this case, it's a sort of defunct, retired Air Force base that used to be used during the Cold War. Again, a callback to the previous episode that we watched, The Turk, in which the connection is made between the Manhattan Project and the Cold War struggle, development of United States' nuclear arsenal. Then we go back to Ellison, who, in which a bunch of other FBI agents, including a younger, peskier FBI agent, who I didn't write down the name of. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't think he ever shows up again, so you don't have to worry about him.
I think it in some ways it fits with the theme of the episode that children or people younger than you don't always do what you want them to. But yeah, the younger FBI agent pokes a bunch of holes in Ellison's theory, and kind of makes him a laughingstock in front of the other FBI agents. And then his partner says, this is just ridiculous. This doesn't add up. And he says, if it doesn't add up, maybe we don't have all the numbers, which I thought is a very clever line. In some ways,
Classic
a very profound. I think it's actually a very profound statement about epistemology. Again, Ellison, great character,
and great actor too.
Yes, and great actor. So John is stuck in this warehouse with this Terminator in this fallout shelter. Cameron has the line, "This is the factory where I will be made." And she explains that coltan is rare in the future. Most of it was destroyed by nukes, and that Skynet appears to be stockpiling it for after Judgment Day. And so we kind of move into our last action scene or last sequence in which John is forced to work together with his mother and Cameron in order to escape, to run away, even though that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to fight.
And you have an interesting question about they managed to steal the coltan that the Terminator had collected and dump it in the river. And if this is the case, why doesn't Cameron disappear like in Back to the Future? And I think that's because of a couple different things. Number one, dumping something in the river doesn't actually destroy it. It's entirely feasible that Skynet would create a scavenging bot that could pick up that coltan and bring it back and use it to mint more Terminators. There's also the fact that I don't think that Skynet that the time travel mechanics in Terminator work at all like they do in Back to the Future. Instead of being a single timeline that you alter, either you're on an infinite loop that can never truly be altered, things don't change, and that's the implication of the first Terminator film, or you are creating new divergent timelines every time you change something from how it was in a future that has sent something back. And that's how nearly every single Terminator film after the first film has treated itself. It hasn't been a single timeline that can be manipulated, but the creation of branching timelines.
Well, and that fits with the theme of the episode. So earlier when they're disposing of the Mook, Cameron chastises Sarah for not just killing him straight off. She says that would be the more efficient way of doing it. She chooses to use the phrase efficient. I think from a human moral perspective, we would just say Sarah's being cruel. But Cameron chastises her for being inefficient. And she says, what I do is not for you to understand. I do inefficient human things. There's this idea that's developed, has been developed in previous episodes, is sort of reiterated again in this episode. The idea that one of the main differences between Terminators in Skynet and humans is that Terminators have a program and follow predictable patterns, whereas humans have free will and often do irrational and unpredictable things, and that survivability can emerge from the chaotic nature of human action.
This is an interesting point because I think that's definitely the feeling I get from the writing, and it's definitely was in the air and the water of writing in this time. I mean, you have in 2002 Minority Report with the "You Can Choose" theme, and iRobot from 2005 with Will Smith, and the idea that robots can choose, and like there's all this free will stuff versus mechanism. And but since you and I are
It's
both,
arguably also a theme in the Matrix films.
yep, definitely in the third terrible Matrix movie. But you and I are actually determinists of some sort. And so when I hear this, I am not actually convinced that Sarah is being unpredictable. What she is being is irrational and, as you say, somewhat cruel. She is not working in a way that is in accordance to the moral principles that she attempts to uphold, but is acting out of fear and anger and hurting someone who, as far as she knows, is not actually knowingly part of Skynet's plan. He is, of course, part of the plan, but just as in a contractor who puts together a building would be.
Well, I mean, he is a thief.
Yeah.
He was part of a gang that was stealing the coltan. So he's not
But Sarah's
without.
not a deputized member of society. She doesn't work for the owners of the coltan, and she isn't acting out of some kind of moral justice towards him. She's angry and afraid, and that's why she does what she does.
Right. Well, I mean, you could argue that it would be, well, it might be efficient to kill him so that it ties off a loose end and he can't tell other people about them. That it would also be wrong to simply kill him.
Right? And I also
Both Cameron and Sarah's solutions to the problem of this mook would be immoral in that sense.
I do think it's interesting that Sarah has such rage at being forced to work with Cameron still. This subsides a bit. She's never happy with Cameron, but she definitely comes to she doesn't have the same knee-jerk visceral hatred that she does here. I am not for you to understand. I think it's an interesting and powerful thing from someone who is, just like most of the characters in this show, trapped by something she never intended. Sarah reacts to that violently, especially in her hatred of machines, even ones which are supposedly on her side.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying before. I think Sarah is genuinely unsettled and unnerved by the idea that Carter, the coltan storage terminator, has sort of duped these human burglars into helping him, which maybe feeds into her suspicion about Cameron. What is Cameron's real agenda, and is Cameron manipulating her?
Yeah. Once
Go ahead.
once they are able to trap the Terminator without the coltan in his garage, Cameron, they have kind of a fun semi-action sequence where Cameron walks off the top of the container truck as it plunges off a cliff, which some of the shots looked a little bit like a CGI car, a CGI truck, which of course it was, but most of it looked pretty cool. And I think that this would be something they definitely spent their money and time planning out to be a nice action piece to end their episode with.
It is also interesting that Cameron saves a bar of coltan from the truck and takes it home with her.
Cameron has secrets, man.
Why she does that, who knows? But it
To
sort
me,
of,
it's quite rational. It's basically like having a Band-Aid or a medical supplies for a Terminator.
maybe, I mean, we don't at this point know what Cameron's apparently Cromartie has extensive self-repair abilities, such that his endoskeleton can find his skull and vice versa. Yeah, I'm not sure what Cameron would do with a bar of coltan. But it plays, it's a visual cue in Sarah's closing monologue, which I rewound so that I could write it down more or less verbatim. So she says that the golem story, which she began with at the beginning of the episode in her opening monologue, is about the pride of man and also of parents. That we think that we can control the things that we make, whether they're made out of clay or metal. And so then we get the visual cue of Cameron looking at the bar of coltan. This is the stuff from which she's made. In some sense, Cameron killed her own parents in this episode. And it's in the nature of us to make our own monsters. Our children are our alloys, built from our own imperfect flesh. And we animate them with magic and never truly know what they will do. So, yeah, I think this is an interesting adaptation of the Golem story, because, of course, the original Golem story is a fable about the dangers of violating the Sabbath. I think that was the original intention of the story, assuming it's not true, which some practitioners of Kabbalah believe. So the idea is that there's a divine plan and order in the universe, including honoring the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, and that the rabbi violated that commandment by allowing the golem to continue guarding the ghetto during the Sabbath, and the golem just goes crazy and starts killing people indiscriminately. In Sarah's adaptation of the story, the moral lesson is that we don't necessarily have control over our own destiny in the future, because the future is not preordained or plannable, and human beings with free will, including our own children, John, do things that we can't predict, but that is in some sense the ultimate source of humanity's ability to save itself, which is in some ways a direct contradiction to the moral of the original Golem legend. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I said, as a determinist, I find the idea that humans are these magic decision-making machines that can create absolutely new things that no one could ever figure out to be pretty ridiculous. But I do think it's a fable we like to tell ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I've often reflected, and I'm saying this as a Christian. I've often reflected on part of the problem with our contemporary obsession with hero myths and superhero myths, is that the reality is that human beings do not have the ability to save ourselves. And we certainly do not have the ability to save ourselves from the actual coming judgment day. And so an overemphasis on human agency is, I think, actually counter to what I believe the true story, the true myth, what Christians believe to be the gospel actually is.
Yeah, it is our duty to do what is commanded of us and to spread the truth as we know it, a different truth than that carved on a golem's head. But we are ultimately not in control, and that is part of the truth that we are supposed to spread.
Now, what I would agree with Sarah on in her closing monologue, and I do think this is one of the valuable moral lessons of the Terminator franchise and of this series in particular, is that human beings have limited knowledge, and so we often do things that have consequences that run away from us. And I really think that's what makes Ellison's line earlier in the episode so profound when he says, if the numbers don't add up, maybe that means we don't have all of the numbers. Ellison is humble enough to acknowledge that if the mystery doesn't make sense, maybe it's because he, as a limited, finite human being, does not have all the information that he requires. There's actually a kind of epistemic humility to the best kind of detective stories. The idea that the truth is discoverable, but maybe not right away because of real human limitations.
We have one last thought that you and I discussed, which is the structure of this episode is less fetch questy and more about a longer, coherent, paired series of plot lines between Allison and Sarah, where our main plot line is very Terminator of the Week, and our B plot line with Ellison is actually driving the ongoing narrative of the season.
Yeah, so um the main plot, the sort of the Connor Cameron plot, really kind of unfolds in sort of three main story beats. They go to find the Coltan because they're hoping to find Cromartie. They realize they can't find Cromartie, but John stows away in the back of the truck. Then Cameron and Sarah go to where the truck is going and help rescue John, or they work together to destroy the Coltan. So it's a very simple plot that unfolds in a relatively few number of scenes compared to other plots that we've seen so far in the series.
I think it's supposed to be as digestible as possible because of what I think is really part of the creative process of this episode, which is to be an episode that can catch up viewers who haven't seen one or two of the previous three episodes. So it redundantly explains a lot of the motivations and themes and characterizations that have already been explained, but within the structure of its own self-contained plot, so that you can really get the sense of you're not just watching a clip show giving you all the things you'd seen before. That's what the Coltan plot is about, but a lot of the character pieces woven throughout give it that sense of, if you missed a previous episode or two, you can keep going with the series, theoretically, if you don't have it on DVD or Blu-ray, and not feel lost in the characterization of these people and why they do what they do.
Yeah, so it's a relatively efficient story that's told in this episode,
Mm-hmm.
but it really, I think, more so than I remember it being, it actually sort of deepens the world building of the series as a whole.
Yeah.
So I would say this episode is not sort of as transcendently well written as the previous episode, The Turk, but it is a good episode. We will of course return to the sort of the main plot line that's introduced in the previous episode, we'll return to Sarah's sort of trying to decide what to do with Andy Good and his machine. In the next episode, do you have any other thoughts about this episode before we conclude?
No, I think this episode, as much as I think it would be cut if this were a show made for a streaming service today, I enjoy the puzzle nature of it. I mean, every beat is basically the characters being confronted with an obstacle and having to figure out how to get over that obstacle, and in the end you have to work together to get, and that's a pretty classic and satisfying structure. So I appreciate that. As a fan of episodic television, I appreciate that this is an episode and not just cliffhanger setup. So, and every cast member, all the dialogue, it all works together in a strong package. It's very enjoyable and well crafted bit of television, with the one exception that I think that the fake out of George Laszlo doesn't quite work for me. I think that it's too transparently manipulative for me to really buy it.
It is. Well, we've talked about how sometimes, and this is something that's been developed from the very beginning of the first movie, the original Terminator movie. Sometimes the intense violence of the Terminators is portrayed for comic relief, and we do kind of, that's kind of the button to the George Laszlo story, is that Cromartie kills George Laszlo in a kind of horrifying fashion, which is at the same time constructed in a way that's meant to be humorous.
Darkly humorous, but
darkly humorous, yes. The fact that George Laszlo is an out of work actor who is replaced by a robot who is pretending to be human. The fact that as an out of work actor, he's kind of living this sort of pathetic lifestyle where he just kind of eats takeout Chinese food and Hot Pockets, and lives in this kind of dingy apartment. Garrett Dillahunt, it's a very self-effacing humor in this episode.
Yeah, it's well done. I think it's good. It creates tension and tragedy and pathos and humor, all good things that you should get from a Terminator story, I think.
All right, well, like I said, next episode we'll be returning to find out what happens to Andy Good. Until then, we'll be back.
We'll be back.